when we start writing. And in fact, most of us continue to have difficulties throughout our writing career. The difficulties just become more and more sort of complex and abstract as we get better and better at writing things well, so we can spend more and more time worrying about the minute little details. But who here would like to put a hand up or even just unmute themselves and just share with us in a few words what they find most difficult about writing a paper? Just a word of warning. I see some of my people I know on the screen. So if there aren't any takers, then I might just address a person or two by name and ask them if they'd like to comment. Who'd like to have a go? Just put your hand up if you'd like to. Don't be shy, there's 72 in the room. I'm sure somebody has experienced some difficulty in setting about writing a paper or a thesis. Yes, Miriam.
So
I think you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I find it challenging to, when I'm writing a manuscript, to write the introduction so that it is on point, especially if the paper is based on one of my objectives, because what I have right now, I have all the information I have from my data collection, but now just to write this paper just on point so that you don't, you don't move around too much. That has been a challenge for me.
Well, thanks for that. You've half answered your own problem because you've identified what it is you're having difficulty with. And therefore, you know what it is that you need to sort out, find out, get used to in order to put your problem right. So just by having expressed the problem, Miriam, you're actually halfway to answering it. And that's excellent. If there's anybody here who's not putting their hand up because they think they don't have a problem with that, then I'd suggest that they are probably not being honest with themselves. Mbali Mbalentle, I see your name up there, and we go back a very, very long way. Seko, have you tried to write a paper? Would you like to comment at all?
Prof, I think I'll also be in the same predicament as the last speaker. I'm also in that situation. Yeah, let me just say that's where you have your data collected, but it's just like now starting. Where do you start? How do you start? What needs to be there without being too rhetoric, but straight to the point as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. And I'm sure if we were to ask more people, they would all say the same. So let's see what Letitia Campira has to say.
Thanks, Prof. I think for me, it's kind of similar to what the last two ladies said. But for me, it's just being able to express myself in a few words and not use too many words to say, to make a point. It's always difficult. And yet with manuscript, you're always restricted to a certain number of words, and that's always so difficult for me.
Right. And I think just now I should show you a sort of a sobering example of that happened to me, in the last week or two. Right. So you're in good company. Winifred, I'm really glad to see people are prepared to share with us. Winifred Ukoa.
Okay, Prof, mine is, if a paper requires you to write both introduction and background, to know what exactly are you supposed to put in the introduction and what should be in the background. And also I wrote a paper where one of the reviewers said that my introduction is more like a literature review than an introduction. So Yeah.
Right, good point. I will address that just now. I do have to make the point, of course, that we write for different purposes. Different types of research are written up in different types of journal. So often there's some variation in what is required of us. Even in journals dealing with the very same field, you'll find vast differences. For example, if you look at the British Medical Journal, you'll find the way they want a paper presented is quite different from the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet, despite the fact that it could be exactly the same bit of research published in each. And the more sociological educational journals do have a somewhat different requirement to the straightforward sort of biomedical publish and experiment type journals. So everything I say has to be taken in the light that I can outline broad principles, but you may well have to adapt them for your own purposes. And secondly, I can't stress enough, if you're writing a paper at an early stage, look at the instructions for authors and follow them. If the instructions for authors says your introduction to be no more than 1,000 words, then there's no point writing a 5,000 word introduction. Okay? As you start writing it, you'd better be thinking how you're going to get rid of 4 out of every 5 sentences. That goes back to what we just heard, you know, the difficulty of condensing things, which can be very difficult. Right, so look at the instructions for authors. The good instructions often give you a lot of guidance on what belongs where. They might actually tell you, in your introduction, you should not review the literature in more detail than could be covered by, for example, 15 references. And the editor will be looking to see that you have made it very clear why the research was undertaken. So if that journal gives that sort of instruction, well, then you know what you've got to do. They are strong on why you did the work, and much less so on a comprehensive review of the literature, for example. All of us who've published repeatedly would have had the opportunity or the experience of writing a paper in one way for a journal, only to have it rejected, deciding to publish it for another, try for another journal, and it was not a case of just printing it out again or, you know, and uploading it again. It actually had to be substantially rewritten for the next journal. The instructions for authors might have been very different, or the journal might actually have a different take on the same issue. One example might be that, let's say, for example, I do some research on medical students from a medical education perspective. So I've done one bit of research, got my results, that's it. I'm not going to do any further research. I send it to a journal called Medical Education, which is a top of the range journal, Medical Education. Let's say, for example, they reject it. Not because it's bad work, but because they say it's not the sort of thing they want. So I consult other people who say, why don't you try the Journal of Higher Education, which is not a medical education journal, you know, it's a journal about higher education. So I decide to do that. But I can guarantee that the paper will have to be substantially rewritten, even though it is the same work, because the Journal of Higher Education would be much less interested in the medical context and far more interested in the basic educational principle in operation here than was the case with the journal medical education. So those are just examples about how it's impossible for anyone, including myself, just to give you a numbered list of things to tick off, and then your paper will be perfectly ready for publication. Okay? Not at all. Right. So perhaps then before we move on, we should say that's why it's often helpful to get advice as you are writing the paper. You know, contact somebody, contact me, discuss the difficulty you're having, or ask someone just to read through your paper and tell you if they think you are sort of hitting the right spot. It's impossible to prepare for a paper by attending a lecture, you know, some time before. They can only give you some idea of what's at stake. But the proof is in the actual writing. And as I said, it varies from project to project, field to field, journal to journal, and you will do well to take advice at that point. The good news is that it's like everything else in life. The first time is difficult. The second time is a little less difficult. The third time is easier still. And by the fourth time, much of the stress and anxiety has gone out of that. But it still doesn't mean that it just happens without any hard work, without any anxiety, without any stress, without any worry. Even when you're writing your 50th paper, a lot of time needs to go into it, a lot of revisions, and quite possibly 1 or 2 rejections before, or substantial, corrections before it finally gets accepted. But having said that, let's go across to PowerPoint. Right, there we are, scientific writing. So, writing papers is really about 2 things. It's the content, what you have to discuss, what you say. But it's also very much the style. That's how you say it, but it's also how you set it out, setting out an argument. So it's only not about good writing, concise writing, as one of you mentioned earlier, logical writing, but it's also how you set it out. And you will hear Colleen and me using this word argument repeatedly. It's critical to science and it's critical to scientific writing. And as I presume you know by now, but a little bit of revision, an argument in this setting does not mean having a quarrel or a fight with somebody. It means putting forward a point and trying to convince other people of that point. Right. Imagine we have a faculty board meeting and everybody agrees that the students need more time to learn and we should extend the academic year from the 7th of June to the 24th of December. Right. You feel this is nonsense. A word you might use when you get up in the faculty board is, in my presentation, I will argue that the work required of the students can in fact be finished in 6 months, and therefore it becomes more appropriate to have an academic year that starts in March and ends in September. That's your word. I will argue. I will put forward the argument. That means you will advance that statement or proposition, and then you will marshal all the evidence and reasoning and thought that supports that. And you may even to some extent go so far as to refuting the opposite. I shall argue that a 6-month academic year makes perfect sense. I shall also argue that it is not necessary to have an 11.5-month academic year. That is what we mean by an argument. Okay? It plays out in courts, law courts, all the time. The prosecutor sets out the argument as to why you are guilty. Your defense sets out the argument as to why you are not guilty. And then the judge has to decide whose argument is more convincing. Papers are written in exactly the same style, and I'll return to this again later. Okay. Let's say you take your rats and you treat half of them with nifedipine and half of them with atenolol, and you find that the rat's blood pressure is better controlled on nifedipine. When you write your paper, that's your argument. In this manuscript, I argue that nifedipine is a better antihypertensive in this rat model than atenolol. That's your argument. So you now have to set out your argument. Why there was reason to believe it before you even started. What other people have already said. What the literature says that might support you in your argument. What the literature says that would tend to work against it, which you now have to refute as not being correct or not being appropriate. And then you're actually going to go on in your results to set out what you found that supports your argument. And then in discussion, you are going to present both sides and explain why, taking all of this together and looking at the results you have, why you believe that your argument is persuasive. Why people should now say the literature supports the belief that nifedipine is more effective in treating blood pressure in rats than atenolol. That is an argument, and it's critical to everything. So we'll talk more about that. Now, just to remind you, papers can be written very well. They can be written well. They can be written averagely. They can be written badly, and they can be very badly written, irrespective of the content. So we could have two students do the same research and get the same results. Let's say they decide that rather than working on one manuscript, one will produce a manuscript and the other will also produce a manuscript, and then they'll compare them and come up with the best solution. I can tell you right now that I would not be at all surprised to find a huge difference in what we can call the quality of the writing, despite the fact that it's the same experiment and the same findings. One student may write it well, or even very well, or even just averagely, and the other student may write it badly or very, very badly. It obviously hardly needs saying that badly and very badly written papers are at an extreme disadvantage when it comes to being marked in a thesis or when it comes to being accepted for publication. And well and very well written papers are at a huge advantage when it comes to those particular circumstances. So it is important. But now let's start about the content. Okay. As you know, this is how we do science. We do the work, we analyze the results, and then we write it up. And this whole month, including today, we are talking about writing it up. The first thing I cannot stress enough is that nobody ever writes a draft of a paper and then submits it. We never even write a draft, revise it, and then submit it. My own writing looks like this: draft 1, draft 2, draft 3, draft 4, draft 5, draft 6, and so it goes on and on and on. And this is me after 30 years of experience, okay? You analyze your results, you think about it, you write a paper. Then you edit it a few times to go through to make it make more sense, to bring the argument out, to remove the errors. But all the time you're thinking about it. As you think, you may actually decide, you know, maybe there's something else I could say about it. So actually go back and look at your results again. You reanalyze them. And then you might decide in your next draft to change things slightly. Maybe you decide that you've overstated the case for nifedipine or something. So you just tone down how you've written it a little bit. You think some more. And then you realize that there was actually a very interesting angle that you hadn't thought about. In fact, the male rats seem to behave differently to the female rats. So you speak to the statistician and you reanalyze things. And now your next draft says a little bit more about the influence of the sex of the rat on the result of treatment with the drug. And so it goes on and on. And that's why it can take many drafts and therefore much effort to get a paper written. So if any of you are stuck on your second, third, or fourth draft and starting to give up, no need to. You are actually doing what all of us do, myself included. That is how papers are written. And that sadly means that no paper was ever written in an afternoon. Okay, it takes time. It takes rethinking, and it takes a lot of editing. So writing goes through multiple drafts, multiple edits, multiple iterations of thinking and analysis, and requires time. It's not the exception, it's the rule. So it's not at all surprising that all of you sometimes struggle, because what I'm outlining here is a very complex process. Some of you probably feel bad, you know, that imposter syndrome. How simple is writing, and yet I can't do it. There must be something wrong with me. It's not something wrong with you, it's wrong with your conception that writing is simple. It's not, it's complex. Right. The right tools for the right job. I won't go into much detail here, I'm always making this. But you will find, obviously, most of you will be using Word for your writing, but you will often find that it's easier to construct tables, for example, in Excel, and then paste them into the Word, than try and type everything into tables in Word, which is meant for a different purpose and is not always very good. I have totally given up trying to construct figures and things in Word. It just doesn't work, even those got drawing tools. So I will always draw them in PowerPoint and then copy and paste them into Word. We have mentioned before, and we'll be mentioning again today, the use of referencing software like EndNote. Okay, and we had that talk earlier in the year from the professor of music, who talked about some very useful software that he has discovered, which makes the writing of theses and papers very much simpler. So in the same way as you learn methods for your research, it's worth learning methods for your writing. How to use Word well, how to use Excel in conjunction with Word, how to draw in PowerPoint, how to copy from one to the other, and how to use EndNote. My next point is being prepared to write. You have to know what you want to say. I found a lot of the problem, and already it's come out just in some of the comments we heard earlier, people preoccupied with thinking that the introduction is the literature review. So they're busy stressing about writing a literature review. What they haven't thought about is, what do you want to say in your introduction? That actually is the point. Maybe a literature review is part of what you want to say, maybe it isn't. Okay. Maybe you want to comment on the literature is what you want to say, not review it exhaustively. If the editor's told you your introduction can be no more than 1,000 words, then quite clearly, you shouldn't be thinking about a 10,000 word literature review. So you need to know what you want to say before you start. The old words, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If your thinking is poor before you start, then you are going to write very badly. And I've seen this over and over and over again. If you are just, if I say to you, what are you doing? I'm writing a paper, Prof. What are you actually writing? What point are you trying to make across? Silence. No, I'm just writing the paper of my research. Right. So what did your research show? What are you trying to put in your paper? I'm just writing my results, Prof. Then I know we're off to an extraordinarily bad thought start. If you don't actually know what it is you're trying to say, then very poor writing is going to come out of it. You guys are PhD level students. That means we're expecting you to be far beyond cookbook, do things by the numbers. Somebody must give me a lecture and tell me what to write in my literature review. Somebody must give me a lecture and tell me how long my literature review must be. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it's not like that. You have to look at what you've done. You have to look at what your journal allows, and you have to decide what you're going to say. And can't stress enough. In one journal, you might review the literature exhaustively in 6 pages. Another journal, on the same research, you might compress all that to 2 paragraphs. Okay? And the 6 pages is appropriate for the first journal. It's entirely inappropriate for the second journal. They will just reject it. And the 2-paragraph one for the first journal, they'll reject it on being completely inadequate and totally not thought out. So there is no answer. The one thing I have to say, though, whether you're writing the sort of paper for the journal that requires a 2-paragraph literature review, you have to know your literature every bit as well as when you write the 6-page review. Okay? Because you have to understand your field in order to be able to condense it that much in a way that still serves the purpose of enlightening your audience. You have to be able to extract 2 paragraphs worth of the main thinking in the field. Okay, and you have to be able to do that without expecting that you be allowed 6 pages to do it so that somebody else can do it for you. So it has to be well planned. And anybody want to guess how I plan my papers and how I plan my lectures? I'm going to stop for a second. Who would like to tell me how they think I prepare every paper I write, and in fact, just about every lecture I give? Put your hand up if you're prepared to tell me. And that includes some of you who've worked with me. You actually know the answer, but you might as well share it with everybody else. No secrets here. Anybody know how I prepare a paper? See if I recognize any of the names of people I've worked with. Raira.
Hi, Prof.
Tell me how I prepare for a paper. Or a lecture.
I'm guessing here with mind maps.
Absolutely. Okay. And I still do that now. Okay. At my current age, with all these years of experience, I start a lecture and I start preparing a paper with a mind map, because that is the very best way to plan how you're going to set things out. In other words, to plan your argument. I'm afraid this talk is probably going to go on long beyond 5:30, but I really think it's important. So let me stop for a second and actually show you exactly what I mean. Okay. Now we could do it in PowerPoint, but I've actually got some software I bought years ago, so it's way out of date, but I've never updated it because they want a lot of money. And what I've actually got is quite suitable for my current purposes. So let me share my screen again. And this is mind mapping software called NovaMind, but there are also some really good free ones on the internet. Right. So let's say my paper is on, what should we make it on? Okay. HIV treatment in school children. Okay. I've done some sort of research on that. I'm one of those, let's say I'm a clinician or something like that. I'm into HIV treatment, but my project has been in school children directly. Right. Now I start thinking, what do I need to do in order to get that point across? So I hit the insert button. What am I going to put in my introduction? Okay. Right. Can ask myself, do I have to say anything about HIV at all? You know, what it is and what virus causes it. Depends who you're writing for, but if it's a mainstream medical journal, quite frankly, it's obviously unnecessary. You know, everybody knows now that it's caused by a virus and blah, 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 and it was first discovered in 1970, whenever it was or something. That sort of stuff is irrelevant in this paper. I'll find, however, that a lot of students will still want to put that in. It's what I call textbook writing. And so even some of my current students have to keep saying, you're not writing a textbook on HIV. You are discussing HIV treatment in school kids. It's about the treatment. It's about the school kids. It's not really about the HIV. So put a question mark. I probably wouldn't spend much time on HIV at all. But what is relevant to my subject? Okay. How common is HIV in kids? Okay. Now that's an important point. You know, we all know that it happens in little babies, pediatric HIVs. We all know that it's sort of common in 20s and 30s, increasing, you know, I'm seeing it in the 40s and 50s in my patients in the ward as the population ages. But I've never really thought about the problem of HIV in the context of going to school. Not university, I think we all know a bit about that, but school. So how common is it? I think I'd better find that out. And in my introduction, I'm definitely going to write something on the extent of the problem of HIV in kids. Okay. It also seems to me very relevant to argue about why HIV in school kids should require a study or research of its own. Okay. What are the differences from other settings of HIV? In other words, the motivations, okay, for my study. Right. HIV in school children is likely to have features peculiar to that particular group that are not found in others. One, it's a period of their life when children are experimenting with autonomy. It's a period of their lives when they are very, very, very sensitive to being different to other people, very, very much at risk of being singled out, discriminated against, bullied. I'm not going to go on further, but you get the idea. It's clearly one of the major factors why we decided to write this paper on HIV treatment in school kids, is because we believe there's something different about HIV treatment in school kids that needs studying and sharing and learning about, that you wouldn't know just from pediatric HIV or adult HIV or even HIV in university students, and so on, and so on, and so on. I would also expect to have to say something about what is known already. And notice immediately, I did not write literature review. Okay. The only reason for reviewing the literature here is so that I myself can remind myself and I can share with my audience what is known already. So I am extracting from the literature and summarizing what is known already. I am not writing a literature review as in a standalone article reviewing the literature. Okay. Now, what else will be here? There may be other things, but obviously another important one is intro to the study. Okay. Intro to the study. And like all good mind maps, I might decide to add, subtopics onto this. Okay. I said the motivation for it. Okay. The target group we chose, Durban high schools, precautions we took, whatever it may be. So all of that would go there. Right. So in that way, I'd build up what I want to say in my introduction. Then I plan what's going to be in my methods, plan my results, and I'm going to plan my discussion. And I'll stop there, but you get the idea. My discussion is going to be already, okay? What did we find? Okay, can this be believed? In other words, arguing that my findings are genuine and valid. Are there any factors that should be considered in evaluating my results? Size of group or possibility of bias or something like that. Okay, what are the implications of my findings? How do my findings match what's already in the literature? How do my findings extend what's already in the literature? What recommendations would I give? Both on the subject, treating kids, but also on research that needs to be taken further. So you see how in this mind map, my paper is actually taking shape. And it's not just a whole lot of words dribbled onto the page. It's taking shape. This is my argument. The introduction sets the scene. The method says how I set about answering. The results is what I've found. And then the discussion completes the argument. Putting forward the case why I believe my results can be believed. Okay, dealing with any possible objection to my results, commenting on whether it's supported by other people's work or whether I'm in fact disagreeing with other people's work, and then saying what it means and how it should be taken forward. That is an argument, and setting it out in a mind map like this makes it absolutely clear to you what you want to do. What I in fact often do then is there's a button here for export. I export this into Word, and all of these things comes out as headings in a document. And then I start writing underneath each one. At the end of that, it looks a bit stilted, but that's all right, it's all down. And now in my second editing, I can start moving things around to make them look pretty. But the basic outline of my argument is now there, thanks to the mind map. Right. So let me stop the sharing at that point. But I cannot stress enough how useful I have found that. And as I said, I do exactly the same with my lectures. I plan what my argument is for the lecture, what I'm trying to get across, what needs to come in, what should be stressed, where it belongs, and so on. So let's go back to PowerPoint. Right. Use of your time. I've said this before. Planning your project takes a huge amount of time, and there's a huge amount of work involved in deciding the research question, aims, objectives, and getting the protocol done. Data collection is actually usually fairly easy. It can be tedious, it can take a lot of time, but basically it's an automatic process, once you're doing it. The analysis, again, takes a lot of time. Seeing the meaning in your results, avoiding error, doing the statistics, reanalyzing, thinking, and then analyzing again to get new insights. Writing up the methods is usually the simplest thing of the lot. You just wrote down what you did, and it needs a bit of editing and tightening up and check that you're right. Writing up the results takes quite a lot of time. There's a lot of effort going into how best to display your results. In words, in a table, in a graph, which results to highlight, which results to suppress, not for scientific fraud purposes, but because they are irrelevant, to your argument. Writing up the introduction is considerably more difficult and takes more time. Okay, making that point again. Saying just enough and no more to fill the introduction takes a lot of thought. And one of our colleagues has already said so this afternoon, that she has difficulty with this. And writing up your discussion takes a huge amount of time, because that's where you are refining your argument, stating and contextualizing your message. Okay. And I find often in people starting papers, their first few papers, totally miss that. And they totally miss the point that the whole point of the discussion is that is where you say why people should take your work seriously and not just reject it outright as wrong, or just say, so what? Okay. They end up again just reviewing the literature or something, and they don't realize that in your discussion, that is your time to make your case about what you've actually said. Right. So it all goes back to the research question again, and I won't spend much time on that. This is the sort of examples. Some of you have heard me talk before, well, you've heard me say it before, repeatedly. I can't stress it enough. So I say to you, what is your research question? And you say, it's about how tall the population is. I say, yes, but what's your research question? That's not a question. So you look at me like I didn't hear properly the first time. It's about how tall people are. And I say, but that's not a question. And you hopefully say, I think it's that people in Durban are not very tall. You're asking me a question. In other words, you don't even know what the question is you're trying to answer. And I've mentioned before, I've had horrendous cases where people have come to me for help in the fourth year of their PhD, and it's become apparent that they don't actually have a research question. They're just talking about something, but there's no research question. This would be a research question. Are men on average taller than women? That's a question, unlike it's about how tall people are. Hypothesis. On average, men are taller than women. Aim. To determine whether the average height of men exceeds that of women. Objectives. To determine the heights of a representative sample of men and women, to compare these heights by controlling for confounding factors. Can you see how that is hard science based on a research question? And it's not a waffly woolly thing about the height of people in Durban. So if you don't know what question you're attempting to answer in your research, then you're going to have great difficulty in your writing, advancing the argument that goes with it. I saw this recently and really loved it. Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Alice sees the Cheshire Cat while lost in the forest and says, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That's very much like you coming and saying to me, please tell me how to write my introduction. The Cheshire Cat replies, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. And my reply would be the same. What point are you trying to get across in your paper? If you tell me it's that men are taller than women, then I can work with that. Then we'll start planning with a mind map. What's known about the height of men and women, why men are thought to be taller than women, why there's any reason for believing that it might not be true and therefore worth reinvestigating. All of that would come out and go in our introduction. I couldn't help you with that if you just told me it's about how tall people are. Right. So Alice says, I don't really care much where I go. The Cheshire Cat says, then it doesn't really matter which way you go. So if you don't really care very much about what you're trying to say, then quite frankly, it doesn't really matter what you say or how you say it. But I doubt that it's going to end up as a very good scientific paper. So, first question, the Cheshire Cat's question. Writing your introduction depends a good deal on where you want to get to. So you have to know that. Right. And then this famous quote by a famous baseball player of many years ago, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. Absolutely true. If you don't know what you're trying to write in your paper, then you're not going to end up where you want to be. Right. We'll skip this and let's get on to get that manuscript written. Right. Our first bit of advice. Get a first draft down on paper, then edit it. Once you've got 10 pages written down, it's so much easier to start seeing what it is you want to say and start making the thing look like it. What people usually do is they write the first 3 sentences, and then they start making some words bold and some underlined, and they change the font and they correct the spelling mistakes. You know, half an hour's passed and they've got 3 sentences down. It's far better to sit down for a couple of afternoons and just write. What I do, I no longer write, I dictate. Okay? Use dictation software. I just dictate. And the computer writes down everything I say. It doesn't matter that it's got spelling mistakes. It doesn't matter that the words left out. It certainly doesn't matter that it's Times New Roman 12 and I want it 11, or that some is bold and it's not. Doesn't matter. Once it's down, you can start editing it. Everything, including spelling mistakes and the formatting. Don't do that as you write. It just stops you ever actually getting the thing written. So it is my first serious bit of advice. Just get the first draft down without worrying. I always say it doesn't even matter if not a single word of your first draft ends up in your final draft. Just having got it down gives you something to work on and concentrates your mind on what you're doing. So write first, edit later. Avoid delay. Interrupting the train of your thought. Going back to try and remember whether receive is spelled R-E-C-E-I-V-E or R-E-C-I-E-V-E is completely, not germane to writing about HIV treatment in school children. So all it does is interrupt your train of thought and stop you actually getting the thing written down. And all that effort you put into that sentence may not even be in the final draft. So it was a complete waste of time correcting its spelling and all of that stuff. And then, as I said, consider dictation software so that you can get the thing written down quickly. Now, I was actually chatting to Antoinette Buerter, who's the school operations manager in our School of Clinical Medicine at lunchtime, who's in the final stages of writing up her master's thesis. And she was commenting on exactly this. And I said, this is exactly what I'll be telling them this afternoon. Protected writing time. 60 minutes all the way through to 4 hours. You start writing, it takes you time to get into the swing. The first 15 minutes, you're still checking that your computer's set up properly and adjusting things and looking for bits of paper and just trying to get in the zone, get the rest of the world out of your mind. From about 15, 20 minutes, you start getting into it. And somewhere around about the 60 minutes and on, you fall into that deep focus sort of area where your brain, I don't know if it's alpha waves or what waves, but your brain is in writing, thinking mode, and you become highly productive, and you can often keep it up for hours. If you try and do it this way, it's absolutely hopeless. You start writing your paper, and in an hour you put it down to go and do something else. Or you start writing your paper, and in an hour somebody phones you, or somebody walks in and knocks on the door, even if it's just for 30 seconds. Mom, where can I find my school lunch tin? That's absolutely enough to put you right back to the baseline. And then you require another 20, 30 minutes to start getting into the zone, and you're not productive again for another 2 hours. And then your husband walks in. Darling, I can't find the car keys. No, I don't want to interrupt you. Just tell me where the car keys are. And that's it. Your evening is wasted. And you've written whatever could be written in those 2 little red peaks compared to what you could have written in this area under the curve. There is 50 times more quality writing in that than there is in this. So no matter who you are, whether you're a professor or a student, set aside protected writing time. when the clinicians, the heads of departments, come to me and say, I want to write a PhD, I have to tell them things like, right, you set aside a day of the week, Thursday, you stay at home, or you go into your office, you lock the door, you unlock the phone, and you tell people that they are not to interrupt you under any circumstances, except to tell you that the president has arrived to see you or that the building is on fire. Otherwise, you do not want to be disturbed. But if you try and write in the afternoon when the phone keeps ringing and you keep checking emails and people keep knocking on your door, it looks like this and you can forget it. So set aside protected writing time of hours at a time. Not an hour here and an hour there, but 4 to 6 hours uninterrupted regularly. My next bit of advice is reference properly, reference carefully, and reference from the outset. I can't tell you again enough how much time I have seen wasted because people don't put the references in while they're writing. And when they come back to look at it again, they can't remember what the reference was or where to find it. And we spent hours trying to re-find it. Whereas if they just entered the reference there and then, there would have been absolutely no problem. It's like when you log on to something and asks you for a new password. There's always this huge temptation, put one in and you think, I'll still remember it tomorrow, I'll write it down tomorrow. Tomorrow comes, you cannot remember what that password was. If you didn't write it down and make a note of it immediately, you just will not remember it later the same day. Exactly the same for references. So we won't spend time on it, except that you absolutely must be using referencing software. Okay, and this is a sort of horror story of the sort of references I see. So a student comes to me, they're writing a paper. Here they put Smith reference. A few weeks later, we come to look at this. I say, which reference is that? Now we start searching. Can't actually remember. So we do a search and we find there are 216,826 Smith references in PubMed. Excuse the language. Oh, shit. No, what do we start? Here they've tried to remind themselves what the reference was. They put P. Jonathan. We cannot find it. Eventually, after hours of effort, we find actually it was actually Jonathan Phillip. It was J. Phillip, not P. Jonathan. Here they went a bit better. They at least said Harris 1995. But when we find the journal, we actually find they got that wrong. It was 1993, not 1995. Now, they remember Harris is important, and Harris wrote an article on viremia. So they've written the Harris article on viremia. We have a look, we discover, unfortunately, Harris wasn't the first author. He was the second or the last author. So searching for it in PubMed was totally misleading. Hours have been wasted, including hours of your supervisor's time, right? So absolutely reference properly while you write and do not leave it as something you do later. Right. I strongly suggest that as you write, you work with what's called author date referencing. Okay. You can always turn it to the little numbers, the Vancouver style, right at the end when you're ready to submit to the journal if that's what they want. The trouble is, as you work through your draft, 21 means nothing. Something like the name of a person and a year takes on an identity. And as you see that coming up and again, you've got a very clear idea of the line of argument that that particular author address that you're using and quoting in your paper. So it becomes very, very meaningful, whereas a number just doesn't. And here is a famous embarrassing event that happened to me thanks to number formatting. This was in a paper I submitted. The issue of format has been addressed, and a recent publication suggests that multiple choice quizzing is effective as short answer quizzing, reference 21. Reading through that, would you see any problem? No, I didn't either. But the editor wrote back to me very puzzled and asked if the reference was correct. And it turned out reference 21 turned out to a paper in 1915, which is the very first ever mention of multiple choice questioning. Okay, so I said a recent publication from 1950. How embarrassing. Had I used author and date formatting as I wrote the paper, I would immediately have seen, hang on, Yerkes and Coburn, 1915. Sorry, my references got muddled up. Let's put that right. Okay. And I would have seen what I meant was McDermott et al. 2014. So strongly suggest that you do your referencing in date, author, date formatting. So you do need to learn a little bit about EndNote, and you'll rapidly learn how easy it is. A touch of one button, and your references will go from Yerkes and Coburn 1915 to 22. Another touch of the button will go back to Yerkes and Coburn 1915. So we're not talking about you having to type it out longhand. So I'm not going to say more about EndNote, except that it does that for you at the touch of a button, and you must just learn how. Right. So as we work through the paper, okay, you will see, because I've put Young et al. 2015, after a while we start to know what Young said, and it becomes very, very apparent that Young is probably a good person to refer in this context. Or I can pick up, hang on, I don't remember Young writing about that. Are you sure that's the right reference? I just would not do it if there were little numbers here. So I won't belabor that point more, but I strongly suggest that as you write, you use author date referencing. Then the final last step before submission, click a button on EndNote and it'll change everything into these Vancouver style numbers for you. Right. Now, the next thing, selecting and using references. I'm going to stop for a second again. And let's just see, I see a few things on the chat. Okay, there. I'm going to ask if a couple of people would like to tell me what they think the point of a reference is in a paper. And I always find it quite amusing. I don't think I've ever yet found a student who could actually tell me all the reasons why we put references in papers. So anybody prepared to stick their necks out, including those who do know the answer, who've worked with me before, as to why we put in references? I'll give you a clue. I think I enumerate 4 main reasons. If the reference doesn't serve one of those 4 main reasons, then it's a bad reference. Anybody on? Oh, Luvo, welcome.
Oh, hi, Prof.
Luvo just started working with me and is a radiologist from Mpumalanga province. Yes.
Yes, Prof. Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, Prof. Okay, mainly to reference, it is to acknowledge other people, like it is to acknowledge other people's work. It is to acknowledge other people's work, to say that this is not necessarily what you're thinking, is what has been researched, and you're acknowledging those people.
Excellent. And I see Andre Bovel has just said the same. It's avoiding
and
pages.
also once then the information has been published and is reliable and has been proven that is reliable, then also I think it gives also a weight into your work to say that what you have published can also be reliable because it's backed up by the appropriate literature.
Excellent. Luwa,
Yes.
unfortunately, is disproving my statement in that people don't know why we reference. But you guys are absolutely on the right track. So won't take us any further. I will tell you what I have written down about it. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. Right. Selecting and using references. Right. The first reason is it's not decoration. I frequently actually do come across students at the beginning of their work, admittedly, who think you put references because you have to put references in. Okay. They don't serve any purpose except somebody says you must, so you must have some references. And the worst I ever saw was an MEd student whose references consisted entirely of website pages. Yeah? Decoration. So if it's not decoration, then what are the purposes? First purpose, the first one that Luvo said and Andre backed up, it's to give credit, okay? Ownership of an idea or result so that nobody can think that you are stealing the credit for something clever. Porphyria has been described as the little imitator. That was said by Waldenstrom in 1937. Okay, so I'm giving credit to Waldenstrom for being the person who made that point. The second is to provide support for a statement. Luval said that too. The genetic contribution to a subject's height exceeds that of environmental factors such as diet. Jones et al. 2016, Smith et al. 2017. Okay. If you didn't have those references, I would say, how can you say that? What evidence is there that the genetic contribution to a subject's height exceeds that of environmental factors such as diet? Did you make that up? You can say no. Two authorities on the matter have said so. Can I refer you to Jones et al. 2016 and Smith et al. 2017? So I can go have a look at Jones and Smith, and I can see two very solid, very well-written papers, and I can come away grumping saying, all right, okay, I accept what you say then, right? So they provide support for a statement. And a lot of my comments, when I help people with their writing, I say, you can't make a statement like that without a reference. Where's the reference? Okay, you can't say, okay, school children have more psychological problems with HIV therapy than do adults. How do you know that? Okay, you have to put support and say, no, Smith and Jones. And if you have a look, Smith has done a study and they found, that 30% of adults have serious emotional problems when they find their diagnosis, and 70% of school children do. So if you put that reference, that provides support for your statement. If it's something you just say, then you must make it clear that it's you saying it, okay? It is our belief that the genetic contribution to a subject's height exceeds, or in this paper, we suggest that the genetic contribution, etc. And sometimes that's important because then you can claim ownership of that. Maybe you're the first to have that idea. But if you don't make it clear now that you are the person saying it, well, then people won't give you the credit. And you'll find to your horror in future, everybody else is giving somebody else the credit when you were the one to say it. Right. So that's the second purpose of a reference, to provide support for a statement. The third purpose, it provides a way into the literature for anyone wishing to know more. Okay. Factors determining the mean height of a population have been recently reviewed in KwaZulu 2019. Okay. So you now don't have to write all about that stuff. If anybody really wants to know the background, they can go and read in KwaZulu 2019 and then come back to your paper. Okay, so it provides further information for people wanting to know more. Now, obviously, if you're going to put a reference like that, well, then you must make sure that that is a high quality reference. Okay, you don't want to reference there a paper that references another paper that referenced another paper and so on. You want to reference the original authoritative source that reviewed it properly. Okay. And the fourth one, as I say, is brevity. If you apply a reference, then you may not have to explain something in depth yourself. We examined the bone density of subjects falling 2 standard deviations above the mean using the method of Singh and Banjal. So that means you don't have to write out the method of Singh and Banjal. Somebody wants to know how you did it, they can look up Singh and Banjal's method, and then they'll know how you did it. So you've saved yourself 2 pages of methods by doing that. Now you might just want to summarize it. Briefly, we did this and this. But you don't have to say 300 microliters of this at 54 degrees for 26.5 minutes, followed by 300 G ultracentrifugation for 2 hours, blah, blah, blah. Singh and Banjal have said it all. So you can make your paper very much shorter by referencing. In some ways, it's similar to the one before. If you can refer people to a very good background reference, then you don't have to review the whole field yourself. There's absolutely no value in science just repeating what other people have said. You rather summarize what they've said, refer people back to what was originally said with a reference, and then you provide your own value, your new value over and above that. Right. So those are the 4 reasons for a reference. Every single reference is there. You should be able to tell me why it's there, what its purpose is. And every statement there, you have to have a look and see, is it okay to have it without a reference, or does it require a reference? And any strong statement that is actually open to argument or disagreement should have a reference. Okay. So these are common errors in referencing, I find. Missing the most relevant references, that's poor search style or too little effort, not keeping up with recent publications, not adequately assessing and comparing the strengths of the cited papers, right? So you find 99 papers stating that men are taller than women. You find 1 paper stating that women are taller than men. It would be totally inappropriate to say, okay, there is no consensus on whether men are taller than women, quoting 1 paper that says they are and 1 says that they aren't. Okay, that would be wrong. You would have to say the overwhelming consensus is that men are taller than women. References C, for example, and you put 3 or 4 or 5 really strong references. Though occasional papers have argued to the contrary. 1 reference of the person against it. That's adequately assessing and comparing the strengths of the cited papers. Okay. And a horrible one is misrepresenting the field. So if you decide that women are taller than men, so you trawl through the literature and you only reference those papers that say women are taller than men, and you absolutely fail to put in any that say the difference. Okay, you may not mean to be dishonest, but that is scientific dishonesty. Right. The next big error I find is misrepresenting the message of a reference, and you won't believe how often I find that. Okay, so somebody says, it is known that men are taller than women, and it says HEF 2022. Something just makes me uneasy. I don't like the look of what my student is telling me. So I actually go and I look up HEF 2022. And I find what it says is, though some people have stated women are taller than men, we ourselves disagree. So in fact, the student has completely misquoted and misrepresented the reference. What they did is they skimmed through it very, very quickly, probably just through the summary, on screen without having got the paper. They picked up the word women taller than men, and they just wrote it down and said, applied that as a reference. If they'd read it properly, they would realize that that is the complete opposite of what that reference said. And often it's confirmation bias. They read that article expecting it to say that women are taller than men. So they saw the word women, men, and taller than, and there it was. They wrote it down as supporting their point of view when in fact it stated the obvious. All right, I will push on a little. Manuscript bisection. Okay. Argument. I talked about this earlier. In this manuscript, I will argue that on average, men are taller than women. Now, you don't have to use those words in your paper, but this is what is motivating the way you write the paper. And I'll do that by presenting my results, which show that men are taller than women, and by evaluating my study against what is known in the broader literature. Multiple studies have suggested that men are taller than women. Reference, reference, reference. This has been shown for all population groups. Reference, reference, reference. Okay. The only exceptions known are some peculiar population in the middle of the forests of the Amazon or something, where it is thought that a highly unusual abnormality in a particular X-linked gene causes men to be shorter than women, and there's the reference. Okay, so that is what I mean by evaluating my study against what is known. The fault, as I say very often, is people try to write a textbook So in the paper, they'll say, okay, height is defined as the number of centimeters when standing without shoes against a vertical scale on a wall. Okay. The height of people was first described in ancient Greece, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Tall people are more likely to bump their heads when walking through doorways than short people, and so on. Now, all of that may be true about height. And if you were writing a chapter on height in a textbook, you might put all of that stuff. But it's entirely irrelevant in this paper, where your argument is that men are taller than women. You're not describing all the things that men have to put up with because they're taller than women, like not fitting in their beds and struggling more in aircraft seats and bumping their heads on doorways and being more likely to have their heads shot off in war or something. That's all true about height, but it's totally irrelevant in the setting of the argument you're putting across that men are taller than women. So here's our mind map. Introduction. What's known about the relevant heights of men and women? What's the current state of knowledge? What are the gaps in knowledge which presumably you're attempting to fill? Okay. Though it is well known that men are taller than women, there are substantial reasons for believing, okay, that the ubiquitous presence of certain of these plastic-derived toxins in the environment may be leading to a progressive reduction in the height of men. Therefore, we set about a study to determine whether in 2022 it is still true that men are taller than women. See, that's a gap in knowledge, current state. Which part of what is known is relevant to my study? And the fact that men are more likely to bump their heads on doorways is not relevant to my study. Why is the topic relevant at all? What's the in question I tend to answer? And I think my example, I gave it to you because for me it now becomes automatically, okay? Because there are reasons to believe the situation may be changing, I intend to answer the question, is it still true that men are taller than women? Is there a trend for men to be becoming shorter and shorter, while women remain the same or even become taller and taller? That is my question. Then how do I intend to answer it? In order to answer this question, we set about a case-controlled study of men and women in a representative community in the city of Durban. That is my introduction. It's not a literature review, okay? It is introducing my project. Subjects and methods, results, not for today. But then we come to discussion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on discussion, but I do want to spend a bit of time because one of the big problems you'll find you'll often have, you don't know whether a thing should go in the introduction or the discussion. Anthony Buerta said to me today, and I've got problems. I'm worried that I'm putting stuff in the discussion that should be somewhere else. This is often the case. And very often, I will find that it could go in either. And I often in my own papers find myself moving things from the introduction to the discussion and the other way around. Right. So the discussion is the other end of the results. How do my results support my argument? What evidence have I produced to support my argument? Have I produced any evidence which undercuts my own argument? Can my results be believed? How does the literature support my argument now that I've got results? Evaluating other people's findings against my findings, comparing, confirming, highlighting, implications of my arguments or finding. So therefore, what I always say to people is the introduction introduces your results. The discussion discusses your results. If you just think of it that way, it makes far more sense. In theory, you could write an introduction before you had any results, but you could not write a discussion until you had any results. But even so, okay, I'm also going to say that the way I write papers is I write the results first because it's only when I'm absolutely clear about what I have found that I can introduce those results and then discuss them. So I'm a great believer in getting my results absolutely nicely sorted out and written up and then writing my introduction. But you'll find many people, including Colleen Aldous, well, they do indeed start with the introduction. But it's just a thought. You may be like me and find that it's much easier to write your introduction once you've got your results totally sorted out. Right. Then all academic writing, introduction or otherwise, how you say things is important. Academic writing style, okay? Acceptable English. Right. And I often find bad English, and I can tell you right now, it's not Black people whose home language is not English. I see appallingly bad English written by, I had to, focus on race, but our white and Indian students whose home language was English. Okay, we know that many people these days are not brought up with good English. We no longer write essays, we only do multiple choice questions. Nobody writes letters anymore. You often don't even write letters anymore. Everything is highly abbreviated, tweets and WhatsApps and so on. And that does not help people to learn good English writing style, let alone good academic writing style. So be aware of that and work with other people to improve your English. Right. Now, the style is not just in being poetic or something. It's in making your meaning crystal clear, avoiding ambiguity. And you won't believe how hard that is. Often when I go through first drafts and even later drafts of my own students have to say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you're trying to say here. To them, it's crystal clear. And yet I cannot see whether they are claiming they believe men are taller than women or if it's the other way around. So got to avoid ambiguity. And that is a lot of the essence of good writing throughout your paper, is being unambiguous. So people can't read what you have said to mean something other than what you intended to say. And then it's this developing an argument, what we wish to find, how we set about finding it, and then in the discussion, what we found. Right, and the word literature review has not come into that. So to summarize academic writing style, saying no more than is necessary, in the minimum number of words needed to convey the meaning, and choosing the clearest, least ambiguous wording. Okay. Some of my closest colleagues and dearest friends that I've worked with for 20 years are still unable to write concisely. Okay. Instead of saying, okay, we chose the highest value, they'll say, we undertook to select that value which had the which was calculated as the maximum in the column of returned results. What that's saying is we chose the highest value, but they've said it in 15 words instead of 5 words. So there's a lot of that, and that is a skill you can learn, and you'll often learn it by working with somebody. Going through your papers when you write with your supervisor, or with a friend, or with somebody else in the department that you know is good at it, or with the editor. And I believe the university has just advertised or is about to advertise for a writing editor in the College of Health Sciences to help you with that. So as I mentioned, my preferences start with the results. The introduction introduces the results, and the discussion discusses them. Right. The introduction introduces the results, not the subject. Okay. Textbooks describe a subject, so that anybody who's read the chapter knows all about the subject. If you are writing about the response of a rat's blood pressure to a particular agent, and you don't start with a textbook description of hypertension and high blood pressure and what is treated with in humans and how common it is in humans. That would be for a textbook subject. It's not for the introduction here. We are introducing why you chose to give things to rats. Okay, and then the discussion. So it's not a textbook chapter and it's not a student lecture where you try to be comprehensive and describe everything so that by the end of it, people know all about high blood pressure. That is not the purpose of a scientific article. There's a section in the journal called review articles, and that's for reviews. There's a section of a journal called research, and that is where you discuss your research. You do not teach about a subject. So bear that in mind. The introduction is not a literature review, but you do have to review the literature in order to write your manuscript. Don't write a textbook. Right. Now, on the subject of literature reviews, and we will stop shortly, you absolutely have to know your literature. If you're writing a review paper, fine, go ahead and include the review in your paper. Okay. If you're presenting your research work, then your literature review has no place in your paper. Carefully select nuggets of information and put them in the right place in both the introduction and the discussion and reference them. That takes a bit of time. Okay. So there is no place at PhD level for literature reviews that said Jones et al. Said, Mkhize said, Naidu said. Okay, you should be doing a critical selective synopsis of the literature, supporting your argument, such as this. Whereas Jones et al. Stated that men are taller than women, Mkhize et al. Found that this is an oversimplification, since it is the mean heights which differ. Indeed, they found that the distribution curves of male and female height in their population overlap by 60%. Our results, in which we show that San men are on average shorter than Maasai women, are in keeping with those of Naidu et al., should be a reference there, okay, who stressed the role of ethnicity, with the mean height of females in some populations actually exceeding the mean height of males in other shorter populations. That's what I mean by a synoptic, intelligent, synthesized, thought through review of the literature, as opposed to Jones said men are higher than women. And Mkhize said this is not always true. Naidu said that San men are shorter than Maasai women. That is not a literature review. That is a praising. It's a poor quote of the literature. Right. And I'm going to stop there. So sorry for going over time, but I hope it was helpful. I see that 86 people have stuck with us through to the end. Thank you to those who've attended. Bye to those who need to go, but I am available for a bit of question and answer or discussion or comments from anybody who'd like to do it. Aviwe says, how do you argue that overwhelming studies support your point of argument? If you reference 3 studies, some reviews complain of bias. Okay, well, the first thing is, do you really believe that yourself? Okay, if you really believe that the studies overwhelmingly support your point of argument, you don't have to apologize for that. It's true. Okay, what you could do is provide all the references, but then that could be 4 lines worth just of references. Like you could even say references available from the author on request. Okay, or you could say 112 papers support this point. See, for example, a few of the most important ones. Or the literature has recently been reviewed by Fortunate Sithole et al., who found that 100 references support men being taller than women and could only find 2 that stated the opposite. And then you only have to reference 1 paper, Fortunate Sithole's paper. Okay, so you see how there's no simple answer to any of this. It's entirely context dependent, and it's driven not by some sort of rule, it's driven by what you're trying to do and what is the sensible, scientifically honest way of doing it. So there might be several ways. But I would argue that if there are 100 studies that said men are taller than women, and one says women are taller than men, it would be completely wrong to put one reference for the for case and one reference for the against case. That would give a very misleading impression that feelings are 50-50. Will you give me 1 second? There's just somebody at my gate that I must... Sorry, everybody, I'm back with somebody selling brooms or wanting money or something like that. I'm expecting somebody, so I thought I had to let them in. Right. Okay, yep, we're back in business. Right. So that's what I would do. As I said, it's a very mistaken argument that newspapers and TV shows fall into. They think that to be balanced, they must interview 2 people, you know, one who says that the earth is round and one who says that the earth is flat. But that is not balanced. Balanced would be having 99 people who say that the world is round and 1 who says that the earth is flat, because that's the actual consensus. Right. What dictation software can be used? I use Dragon Dictate, which does cost a couple of thousand, but it's much easier now because I've got previous editions, you know, it's cheaper to update. It's called Dragon Naturally Speaking by Nuance. But Microsoft itself has its own, I think, built-in dictation now that comes with Windows. And Google, I think, also has its own dictation. And both of those are free to use if you've got Microsoft, or for Google, it's free for everybody. And they really have got very, very, very good now. So all my writing now, in fact, I find it extremely difficult to write without dictation now. It takes me far too long and my fingers cramp, you know, and all the rest of it. So just do a quick search on the web and find what's available for dictation. But I think you'll find that both Google and Microsoft will do it for you. But certainly this program that I've now used for 20 years called Nuance Dragon Dictate is very good. Right. Plagiarism avoidance we won't go into today, but it is very important. Okay. Lots of people say nice things, which I thank you for. Right. Any questions or comments from anybody here? Put your hand up or put something. Where's the Q&A? I don't think I've seen anything there. Put anything on the chat or put a hand up. Elliot, we can always rely on you to participate. What would you like to tell us?
I just want to find out when is it possible to use grey literature if you feel there is something very important?
That's an interesting question. Nobody's asked me that before. Okay. I think the answer is, if there's something there that you think is important, then to be scientifically honest, you must, you know, include it. But if it's from a source, you know, that is not entirely dependable, reliable, the important thing is that you acknowledge that. In other words, you state it.
Yes.
So that somebody does not read it and think that it comes with the same authority as something written in the New England Journal of Medicine or Nature or Science or something like that. Okay, okay.
Thank
A
you, Prof.
recent article, okay, in a non-mainstream journal, you might say, probably referenced, has strongly suggested that women are taller than men. Okay. We undertook this study believing that it was critical to determine whether this was indeed true or not. Something like that. If you look at the grey literature and it looks like rubbish, well, then just leave it out. The same way as if you read the official literature and you decided that a paper was rubbish, you would leave that out too. Okay.
Yes.
So citizens, again, as a scientist, you're trained to think and use your judgment, not to follow rules. So use your judgment. And as long as you explain your thinking and your judgment, nobody can find fault with you, and you're being an excellent scientist.
Thank you.
No matter how good a scientist you are and how clever you are, if you are unintentionally guilty of misleading people, well, then you haven't done a good job. Unintentionally misleading, without realizing it, not having quoted the literature in a balanced way, or having stuck a very dodgy reference out there as though it's something that could be believed, then you have not done science any favors at all. But if you've said, this evidence appears compelling, and that evidence, though interesting, is not yet very strong, then you have helped your readers to get the right context and the right take of a particular argument. So every reference you read, whether it be in a newspaper or in a scientific journal, as we've said before, now the trick is you have to decide how compelling the argument is, okay? Whether it be in a newspaper or in a journal. And then when you hand that across to other people, you need to indicate to them how compelling you found it. So in other words, wave an orange flag if you think they'd better check themselves and make up their own minds. Wave a green flag if you are pretty convinced no sensible person would disagree with you on your interpretation of that paper. So science is all about that judgment. We can't give you a list of rules to follow and then you'll have a perfect paper or a perfect thesis. Okay. So thank you for that, Elliot, as always.
Thank you, Prof.
Any comments? Slee and Miriam, both your microphones are on. I don't know if you want to say something, or perhaps you could put them off. Right, to see any last things on the chat. Right. Let me just write the name of the software. Let me actually see if I can change to that particular program and show you what I mean. Let me just get it up. Those who need to go, please go. Those who want to see dictation in progress, stick around. Just loading it. Right, let's get up Word now. I'll warn you right now, we might have a slight problem because we might find that Zoom is competing with this program for the use of the microphone. Let's see what happens. Here I am writing. Oh, it's working. Okay, so let me change to Word. Did you guys see that appearing on the screen? Could you hear me talking? Had to mute the microphone here so that there wouldn't be competition.
Yes, Prof, we can hear you and we can see.
Yeah. And you saw how quickly the words appeared on the screen as I was writing. I wasn't typing.
Oh, no, that was very, very fast and quick, Prof. Yes, yes.
Now you see how much time you spare and how quickly you can get your first draft down if you dictate instead of typing. And
Yes.
I think it got one word wrong. Instead of saying unhelpful, it said I'm helpful or something like that. You know, one word was wrong out of all of those lines. It's got very, very accurate now. What these things do, they actually learn. When you first start, it makes some mistakes, you correct them, and it's a self-learning algorithm. So it learns to recognize your voice and to get things correct for you. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. Okay. Now, I believe that all of these things are turned into a recording. I know it is being recorded. If the people particularly want it, then maybe I could also just take charge of that and make sure I produce my own recording of it, as opposed to just waiting for Colleen and Pumla to do the standard Zoom thing. There seems to be a lot of interest in this. Okay, so one way or another, it will be available. All right, so should we leave it at that? It is now 5:15. Thanks very much for everything. And Luvo, you and I need to have a chat sometime.
Okay, Prof. Thanks a lot. We'll do that. We'll arrange
All
a
right.
meeting.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
enjoy, Prof.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Prof.
Prof. Bye.